Diana Meyer, and I am with Deep Green Resistance, which is a new radical environmental movement. Deep Green Resistance is for those who can't wait anymore. It's for the heartbroken. It's for those who are tired of ineffective activism. For those who know the real world and are willing to do whatever it takes to protect it and restore it and ourselves. And most importantly, for those who are willing to consider a new strategy. DGR has a new strategy for anyone who wants to fight for the planet and all beings and win. Information about DGR is available for anyone interested at the entrance, along with these t-shirts. Please feel free to take the informational packets and contact us about joining in our fight to save what is left of our planet. As we begin to understand the increasing rate of extractive activities the oil companies are engaging in on our public lands, it becomes critically important for all of us to get informed on the major issues that are facing us in the very near future. It is our hope to be part of forming strong coalitions throughout Colorado that will help ensure that the big oil companies are held accountable for their actions and to ensure that environmentally destructive practices are just not allowed. Using a multi-pronged approach, non-violent direct action, legal challenges, and building alternatives, we can successfully protect and restore the land base. All of us here are taking a step in this process by attending this meeting to get the information we will need to act decisively. I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening. First, I would like to introduce Wes Wilson. Wes was a member of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and he became the second officer in the U.S. Army to be a conscientious objector. He is now a retired EP analyst, I think 30 years, is that what you?
37.
37 years, who exposed the potential dangers from fracking on the public's health in a letter to Congress, and then stood up to be counted in the Academy Award nominated documentary GASLAND. Wes has received numerous awards from the EPA for his outstanding services in defense of our lands. Next is Phil Doe with Be the Change. Phil headed up the office that regulated water subsidies for the Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation. He appeared on 60 Minutes as a whistleblower against Big Agriculture's attempts to thwart controls set by Congress on ag water subsidies. He was also the agency's environmental compliance officer, among other posts. He helped start and lead a grassroots organization opposed to the lavishly wasteful Animas La Plata water project in southwest Colorado. He has written op-ed pieces on water for both the Denver Post and Rocky Mountain News, and articles for Counterpunch and for Colorado Central Magazine. Currently, he is at work on an article on fracking in Colorado. Both of these individuals have worked tirelessly to ensure that the public is aware of the inherent dangers involved with the extractive gas procedure known as fracking. I would like to ask everybody now if you could please hold all your questions till after the talk so they can get that out of the way and you can hear and take in what they have to say. And after the talk, we will also have Kay Fissinger, and she's going to announce some public meetings that are happening this next week in Longmont that are focused around fracking. And then also I just want to say that I'm so honored to have both of you here today at the Nomad. And please welcome our guest, and let's use this information to secure a healthy future for all that share this beautiful land base.
Well, I see the first thing I got wrong was the Deep Green Resistance. That's a much better name.
I'll say.
Earlier this spring, I got invited back to Salem State. They gave me an award, and on the way back, I heard this little one with a fellow passenger in the plane. Seems a blonde walks into a bank in New York City and asks for the loan officer. She says she's going to Europe on business for 2 weeks and needs to borrow $5,000. The bank officer says that the bank will need some kind of security for the loan, so the blonde hands over the keys to a new Rolls Royce. The car is parked on the street in front of the bank. She has the title and everything checks out. So the bank agrees to accept the car as collateral for the loan. Bank's president and its officers all enjoy a good laugh at the blonde for being so dumb as to use a $250,000 Rolls Royce as collateral against a $5,000 loan. An employee of the bank then proceeds to drive the Rolls into the bank's underground garage and parks it there. 2 weeks later, the blonde returns, repays the $5,000 and the interest, which comes to $15.40. The loan officer says, "Miss, we are very happy to have had your business, and this transaction has worked out very nicely, but we're a little puzzled. While you were away, we checked you out and found out you were a multimillionaire. What puzzles us is why you would bother to borrow $5,000. And the blonde replies, "Where else in New York City can I park my car for 2 weeks for only $15 and expect it to be there when I return?" Well, I use that joke to indicate the wealthy think differently. And if you think the wealthy think differently, wait till you see what's coming to the Front Range. We're in the midst of one of the biggest oil booms in this country, right here on the Front Range. And no place will be undrilled. How do I advance the slide?
You point at me.
Okay, go. Next slide.
I got this one. Is this good?
It's important to focus a little bit on why we use domestic gas. First, it's ours. It's a U.S. product. You know, the United States does not export gas. So from a natural gas point of view, you know, so far it's all developed and used within the United States. It does burn clean, the natural gas part of it. In our office at EPA, we would say, you know, I'm not going to go through with that. In our office at EPA, we'd say no rocks or SOx or NOx in this natural gas burning, because when you burn it, it burns clean. But when the industry produces it, they have a lot of leaks. Those leaks are so extensive that they actually offset natural gas's advantage to coal. This is quite a controversial subject. Next slide. This was information just published this spring by Robert Howarth of Cornell. I met him back in New York. And what he had done was just put together a clever accounting thing, how much natural gas is produced and how much gets vented, gets leaked. So when he applies a factor of 105, it looks like natural gas is actually worse than coal. Next slide. I used the point that the industry can get blood from a turnip. They're going to be drilling everywhere that was under the sea at one time. Well, this is a kind of a dated map. Doesn't even have the Niobrara formation on here. But any place that was under the sea produced organics that did not decay because they were at the bottom of the sea. Now, with these new techniques of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, the industry is capable of getting blood from a turnip. That is, they're capable of getting oil and gas from the very rocks that source it. They're not looking for the traps. Next slide. This is what it can look like. This is really dense, 10-acre spacing in the Jonah field. Jonah, Wyoming, turns out to be the only place in the United States where we have ozone violations entirely due to the oil and gas industry. Every place else we think of ozone and as being a problem in a southern city in the summer. Think of Atlanta, LA. But here we have ozone exceedance of the national standard in the wintertime. Now what the industry was doing, in our grandfather's day, they were looking for oil in traps. You know, think of the Titusville, Pennsylvania. Oil was actually bubbling to the surface. They were looking for places where the geology allowed the oil to seep up through the rocks and get trapped in an anticline or up against a fault. If it didn't get trapped, that would just come to the atmosphere and not be a suitable resource for the industry to exploit. That's changing. That's completely changed. What they're after now is the source rock. That's why I say there's no dry holes. They can get blood from a turnip. We aren't going to see mis-drilling in this kind of circumstance. You can see where if you were looking for conventional oil and gas in a trap, you could be off of it and have a dry hole. But if you drill anywhere on the Front Range, you're going to hit oil with this new technology. Also, the industry had a much different interest in how they handled their produced waters when they were doing these conventional traps. If they would hit an anticline, you would find gas, oil, water. And then as they produced that formation, they started getting salty water. They would just re-inject it right where they came from. Not down the same hole necessarily, but down the next well. And so the industry would re-inject so it would keep pressure back up so they could produce more oil and gas. Not so in the new business. They don't want to re-inject right where they're getting it, so they have to process a lot of water that comes back to the surface. And in the case of fracking, it'll come back toxic. Let me talk about a little bit what fracking is. It requires the industry to go down vertically and then drill horizontally. And the techniques are perfect. They have GPS at the end of that drilling head so they can pinpoint where it goes, and it can stay within the formation. You can see if you drill right through the formation, you don't hit much rock. But if you drill down and go horizontally, your drill bit's coming across all that additional rock. And often these horizontal legs will go out a mile or more in length. And if you see a map of these new Niobrara wells, you'll see they're all lined up, kind of all lined up from the southeast to the northwest because they're at right angles to the existing fractures. They want to hit as many fractures as they can. Well, they go down, and let's just talk about the horizontal leg. They will put in a production pipe and cement around it, send down shape charges, think like Bangalore charge, ever heard of that? It's like a torpedo thing they put in there, and it blows out, but not very far. It blows out 3-6 feet, blows holes in that concrete and steel. Next process is hydraulic fracking. It'll take hundreds of trucks. These fracking jobs in the Niobrara may take 5 million acre-feet, 5 million gallons, 15 acre-feet per frac job. You'll need 100 tanker trucks to run one of these operations. That water is mixed with guar gum and sand. And the guar gum acts as a thickening agent. You know, it kind of goes down as almost like jello. And it carries the sand back into their fractures. So they raise the pressure up enough to crack all the rock. Out thousands of feet horizontally and maybe several hundred, we don't know this information too well, but several hundreds vertically. And that exposes up that whole halo to additional oil production. But after they push that sand down in there with the guar gum, they've got to get most of it back out so that sand will stay and hold open the fracture that they just created, otherwise it would collapse up. So they put a lot of ingredients in it to change that in just a couple hours. Some of these ingredients are called breaking agents, but they also use surfactants. And because they have guar gum, they have a lot of biocides. It's like putting food underground, and the industry doesn't want bacteria foaming and interfering with their process. So a lot of biocides. In fact, even after the frac jobs, over every couple months, they'll be loading the place with biocides in order for that guar gum not to react on them. But they use a lot of chemicals, and I think you understand their secret. We don't know what they are. Next slide. Here it explains that a little better. This is an industry blue side. They want to emphasize how far it is from the aquifers near surface that they go down and then go horizontally and frack. Now here in Colorado, we're going to have quite a few aquifers up here. The Dawson, Laramie Fox Hills, the Denver, and they're quite thick. They all need to be protected from these fracking operations. Otherwise, the fracking fluids could move laterally into the aquifers we use. Next slide. Now, what I became famous for, the reason I get calls like this to give presentations, is because in 2004, EPA came out with a study that was just patently ridiculous. I've never seen a study quite like this. It was blatantly obvious it was fraudulent. EPA said that the industry introduces toxic components into the ground and it presents no risk. It made no sense. And it was the only scientific report I've ever come across that says there's no need for additional scientific work. Never met a scientist in my career that actually said we need less data. EPA was particularly focused on in the process of using diesel because diesel contains BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylene, xylene. Benzene is quite toxic, a carcinogen. It's toxic in low concentrations. Just a couple of drops for a swimming pool would exceed the drinking water standard. So the drinking water standard is 5 parts per billion. So EPA was concerned about using diesel and tried to get and did get agreement with most of the industry to voluntarily not use the diesel part. What I complained about was this fraudulent report didn't have legitimacy because the experts EPA used were working for the companies. And indeed, one of them worked for Halliburton. So we had 5 of the 7 people on this panel, you know, with financial ties to the industry. And the following summer, now the Inspector General at my request did start an investigation late in 2004, but by the following summer, Congress had used this report to say, see, EPA concludes there's no risk to fracking, and passed through an exemption called the Halliburton loophole, which exempts the process of hydraulic fracking from regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Next slide. EPA is back on the job. The Obama administration has responded to Congress's request to do a study. Now this study is going to take a long time. There's supposed to be some preliminary results at the end of next year, but final results not until the end of 2014. They have a $12 million budget. Much to EPA's credit, it's looking at the life cycle of these chemicals, not just how they're used downhole, but where they're made, and particularly where they end up after some of them come back in the produced water. They will look at this big issue that Phil will talk about later. This industry takes a lot of water. EPA study is supposed to look broadly at the issue of the total water demand. Unfortunately, EPA dropped the ball and is not going to investigate the air pathway. That is, EPA is no longer looking at the scientific issue, the fracking fluids that come off of this process and get released to the air cause a public health problem. And I should have explained that. Once they frack, the well can come back at them pretty hard. It can come back at high pressure. So once they do a frack job, it comes back not to tanks, but is released to an open pit called a reserve pit right next to the well. And there they intentionally evaporate it. I mean, Colorado is blessed with so much sun and so little rain. You know, we can always count on net evaporation of 4 feet every year. So they're getting rid of their volume of water, but at the same time, they're getting rid of their hazardous air pollutants, which are volatile. Sometimes these are built up to such concentrations that the oil and gas commissions encourage the industry to light the pond, to burn them off rather than let them evaporate. Okay, EPA is no longer studying that air pathway. So we talk about these exemptions under the Safe Drinking Water Act. That's the biggest one, the Halliburton loophole. It means that companies are only regulated by states in that regard. You know, this is an unusual business. If you ran a restaurant, you'd be regulated by the county, probably the city you're in, and the county and the state. But if you ran a nuclear plant, you'd be subject to extreme regulation by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and portions of the state. But if you run an oil and gas company, you only are subject to rules by the state, not the county, and not the federal government. And here we see why. If you leave here with nothing else, I want you to understand that all these loopholes are bipartisan. Then Senator Barack Obama from Illinois voted for the Halliburton loophole when he was in Congress in 2005. They are exempt from the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which is the National Hazardous Waste Law. Any other business, if you're producing hazardous waste, you have to process them what's called cradle to grave. You have to make sure they don't get into the ambient environment. This industry is exempt. As a result, we have many of these produced waters and drilling muds going right onto the land in Colorado. That wouldn't have been allowed except for this exemption of the hazardous waste law. And they're exempt from our liability law called Superfund, Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act. This is the act that came out of Love Canal, you know, where people are so damn fed up with the chemical industry. They put in a law that does take taxes from the oil and gas industry and other chemical producers and uses that to clean up either existing or abandoned chemical disposal. But this industry is exempt from that law, and let me tell you how that plays out. It means they're not subject to strict liability. So let's suppose you were the owner of this theater, And the previous owner had a car lot here and dumped a lot of oil on the ground, and they had contaminated the ground right here. Then you buy the theater and it's underneath. Well, if the government finds out, they'll hold you responsibility. You're the current owner. You don't get away with saying the previous owner did it, but the oil business does. So if they have a pollution problem, the state government, or sometimes rarely, if the EPA is investigating, it's become bad enough and EPA is investigating, the government has to prove who did it. And the industry has an enormous way, clever ways of saying, we never did it. Either nature did it, or the previous owner did it, or the homeowner did it. It's never the oil companies. And here's this example will make it clear. In Pavilion, Wyoming, EPA scientists are working there because it's a serious problem. We've got 15 or 20 homes with badly contaminated water that EPA's ordered water hauled in. The question is, how did that happen? How did their groundwater wells get polluted? Well, EPA scientists are sleuthing on the job, and they find 14 of these wells in a concentric circle have something in their wells called 2BE, a product called 2BE, which is 2-butylethanol, which is commonly used in fracking. So our EPA staff is thinking, well, this may have come from the industry because here's the signature of it. It may come from a leaking pond or some poorly constructed well. EPA attorneys and Justice Department attorneys have to go into what's called discovery prior to going into federal court. And in discovery, EPA attorneys are presenting their evidence to, in this case, the companies in Canada. In Canada, a large oil and gas company that is on the Front Range here, out of Canada. And the company attorneys come back and say, well, if you present that to the federal judge, we're going to tell the judge, we didn't do it. That's individual landowners pulling up their own domestic well pump and degreasing with product 409 that contains 2BE. You know, it's almost laughable. But it's causing the EPA, not to press its case forward in federal court. Had this industry been subject to liability, EPA would have just said, you're here, you, the company, are here, you're responsible. And it could have held them accountable. Next slide. The industry will even agree with this slide, but not the next one. The industry will agree that sometimes there's bad wells. Now these wells are going to cost $3 to $5 million. When was the last time you saw any human enterprise at that scale, not have some problem with it? So lots of things go wrong in the field, lots of things do go wrong. But if they're engineered right, they're supposed to be isolated from all those aquifers. Sometimes the nightmare for some of these drillers is when they're drilling down the initial part of production, they might actually lose the circulation of their mud. The mud goes down the inside of the pipe and then comes out the outside of the hole to bring the cuttings back up. Otherwise you couldn't drill. You've got to bring the rock that you're cutting back to the surface. So this mud is heavy enough and thick enough, it picks up that rock chips and brings it right back up. Loss of circulation means when that mud's not coming back to the surface and bringing its chips. Guess where it's going? It's going into some aquifer, some sandstone, because it's leaking right out of the open hole. Loss of circulation is a big thing. It's bad wells. One of the things that led to the Deepwater Horizon example was poor construction. Among the many problems of that catastrophic failure last year was that there was simple, one of the companies, I can't remember which one, I'm sure they're pointing fingers at each other, had not put enough spacers down the hole before they put the concrete in. You imagine this big set of pipes sitting in the hole before they get the concrete. And they want that pipe centered in the hole, and then they're going to get concrete casing, which is going to protect the aquifer. Well, they got to have spacers to keep it in the middle. In the case of the Deepwater Horizon, they ordered 4 spacing when some of their experts said they needed 25. As a result, this pipe would have hit the edge of the hole and not had cement all the way around it. Bad wells cause problems. Spills especially cause problems. And I really invite you folks who think this is coming and you need to do something, work on this issue, because although the state regulates drilling, only the county is going to regulate spills and transport of these toxic materials to the site. And of course, leaking pits. We hear anecdotal reports from the field. Some of these drillers, their cycle's so geared towards produced water coming to a pond and then trucking it off to some facility That if they're getting too much, we've heard of drillers shooting holes in the pits so that they'll leak and they won't have to truck as much off. Makes sense to me. On average, we only have wells inspected 10 minutes per year in the state of Colorado, per well. Now, anything can go wrong on the production fluid side, but don't get rid of it right. Most of it is, like I say, being evaporated and then trucked to a disposal well where it is ejected itself. Now, I put on here all the community sewage plants, but that doesn't happen here. That's only happening in places where it lacks the sun and little rain as Colorado. That's happening in Pennsylvania. And I think EPA is about to stop that particular practice. Next slide. What the industry won't agree with is this slide. Whether there are risks with all the wells. Are they systemic? And one of the bigger issues, we know this air pathway is systemic. We know that they intentionally are getting rid of their hazardous air pollutants. With this tripwire. They're getting rid of their hazardous pollutants that are volatile, at least, by intentionally evaporating them. Some of these ponds, have aerators in to increase that. So we know that's a systemic risk. We don't know if there's a systemic risk associated with the geologic cover, though. We have no process by this state or any other that looks at whether there's an adequate geologic barrier between where they're fracking and the surface. And I've been speaking about this for 3 or 4 years, and I hadn't seen any support from my personal view that that might be risky. Until the report came out for the city of New York, which used this phrase, there may be brittle geology. Everything's fractured. And the new fractures underground may connect to other fractures, in which case the first thing you would expect to escape is the methane itself. The latter part is great need of a couple of PhDs. We have a big interest in knowing whether these VOCs can just come off the pit and condense onto particles and then come back into the ecosystem. This is the issue I'm going to try to take to Los Angeles and get the downstream state interested in some of this potential toxics that are coming into their river system. The reason we know about fraction chemicals at all has to do with a previous report by Henry Waxman, who was, at one time, if you recall, he was had the chairmanship of the House Resource Committee there for 2 years, and he used his used the congressional authority to demand this information from the industry. EPA was doing a similar thing and had to actually subpoena Halliburton to provide the information. So this report by Waxman and the rest of his committee really is an exhaustive list of these wide range of chemicals. I think many of you saw GASLAND, and at that time we were up to like 900 chemicals. Think of those chemicals as being on the shelf, and then the industry can go to the grocery shelf and pull out from the grocery what it needs for a particular recipe. So any particular recipe may contain 20, 30, 40 chemicals, not all 900, because the geologic conditions vary. Now this summer, Secretary Chu said he was going to commission his own committee to look at fracking, and I did like the question. The question is right, so what is needed to make fracking safe, but to me it looked like Yogi Berra said, it looked like deja vu all over again, because the committee members, 6 out of 7 of them, had financial ties to the industry. But the results weren't too bad. I mean, what they say was it cites air pollution as a significant concern. It calls for disclosure of these frac fluids and not leave them secret. And it focuses on this issue of waste transport of produced water, which used to be just briny water, until they started fracking, and some of it comes back, so now the produced water is toxic. But the same Dewey report downplays 2 reports I'm going to mention a little further, one by Duke University and this Cornell report I already mentioned. The Duke University was an important one. In May of this year, Professor Howard and his colleagues looked at some 68 domestic wells next to Marcellus gas wells in Pennsylvania. And they found an alarming result. They found 85% of these domestic wells already had high concentrations of methane, the kind of methane that comes from the field called thermogenic methane. So right away when I see 85%, that's giving me information that doesn't sound like it's bad well. It sounds like it's ubiquitous, a systematic risk. But this report downplays that, and the industry is now responding to this finding by Duke University, and they're putting up some of the common cards that the industry has to play. You lack baseline. You didn't know what was there before you studied it. And the gas could have got there by nature. Nature what done it? Especially when gas comes to the surface. You know, we do have some disclosure rules. 8 states now have some requirements to say the industry's got to tell the public what chemicals they're using. Wyoming is considered the best, but it still allows a company to petition the state, and the state can agree to hold back. And in fact, the state has 156 chemicals that are being withheld from the public based on their proprietary information request by the industry. Colorado has a kind of disclosure rule, but only because we had a very serious incident in Durango in 2006, I think it was. A nurse named Kathy Baer went down, that is, she had compromised health as a result of triaging a patient who came in from the oil field, and his boots were filled with a lot of unknown fluid. While she was processing him, she was exposed, and several days later she goes down with renal and liver failure. When her medical doctor, the nurse's medical doctor, called the operator to find out what chemicals were in use so he could treat his patient, he was denied. Even in those circumstances, the industry said, no, none of your business, doctor, these are secret chemicals. Well, as a result of that, it was too far over a certain political line, and the legislature did pass a requirement that they need to be disclosed in the case of medical emergency to a doctor. But we, the public, can't know. Now, Hickenlooper says he's going to change that by the end of the year. We'll see what kind of rule they develop. The industry response is, like many things, okay, we'll voluntarily disclose this. And so it's no requirement. They're putting some of the information up on a common website. But the only information we're getting in terms of recipes, that is, in terms of concentrations of these chemicals, not whether they're used or not, is coming out of the Wyoming disclosure, which actually requires, except for these few proprietary ones, that the amount of chemical be listed by the operator and posted on the web at each time they're fracking. EPA is trying to come to the rescue. I was at a hearing a couple weeks ago where EPA is, for the first time, is stepping up and saying we're going to this release of hazardous air pollutants, so in a systemic way, is too significant a problem. I mean, EPA really got shocked when the ozone standards were being exceeded in rural Wyoming, entirely due to the industry. And what EPA didn't understand then was the amount of emissions of these volatile organics was 10 times higher than EPA had previously estimated it to be. And in large part because of fracking, because of the fracking chemicals were being intentionally volatilized right in that open pond. So EPA is coming in with a new rule. Boy, we've got to support the agency and see this rule get completed. It's supposed to be done by next March, and for the first time, the EPA would actually have a presence on the drill pad. It's pretty stunning. What they would do would be to require green completions. Since not let these damn wells burp back all their toxic stuff into an open pond, they would require it to be taken to a tank and various other things that would make money for the industry. So clearly EPA's got a good hand when it comes to trying to support this particular rule. It's going to cost a lot for the industry to do it, but they're going to capture some methane that they can sell, and then these hazardous air pollutants will be burned off and not released for us to breathe. So I'm certainly encouraging EPA to move forward and get that rule done. By the way, the only reason the agency's moving is court-ordered obligation to move forward. Biggest change here, however, was Obama rejecting the administrator of EPA's proposed improvement in the ozone standard. The science has always indicated that ozone should be at a lower concentration to protect the public health, particularly asthmatic children or older people. Ozone is like causing a sunburn inside your lungs. Really, kind of a small amount can do that. And the science has always been there that you'd have less asthma and less hospitalization. And EPA administrator came to the president and said, if we implement this rule, there'll be less cost to society, even though it's a staggering cost to industry to meet this requirement. But the president declined and put it off. You know, we do have some bans. Sorry about this slide. But France has made a total ban on fracking. It's quite a remarkable thing for a whole nation to do that. Switzerland has done too, although I think that's a little bit symbolic. There's not a lot of potential there. New York has banned fracking within its watershed. Now it lets the other 85% of the state be drilled, so the other 85% is not pleased with the New York State legislature. But the state legislature said, look, it's too high of a risk to frack in our watershed. Right? Anything like that in Boulder or Denver? No. We now have 110 communities in the United States that have banned fracking or posed some type of a moratorium. And particularly I invite you, if you're thinking about this type of thing, look at how these two cities differ. Both have done a ban, but entirely different bases. Pittsburgh did it based on a community's right to clean air and clean water. And it's an important one. And it's not nominal, even though it's a city. There was already leasing inside the city limits. There was potential drilling coming. And the city made this ban based on community rights. Morgantown did a ban based on zoning, trying to keep industrial activity outside the city. They have gotten sued. Next slide. We don't get to see anything that goes wrong underground, so I'm going to show you a few pictures above ground. This is a blowout from a Marcellus well. This well kicked back at 30,000 psi. One of the things I didn't realize until this event occurred is that the industry doesn't have its blowout preventers when they're doing a second frac. We all became familiar with the blowout preventer because of the big thing at Deepwater Horizon, how big of an issue it was to actually cap the well. A blowout preventer is like a shear. It's like, here's the pipe, and there's hydraulic shears that can be triggered in an extreme emergency and cap the well. Well, those are required when industry's drilling, but when they come back for the second frac, all they're relying on is their pumps and valving within their pumping system to hold back the underground pressure. This one blew. But this is not a fracking event, I want you to know. The industry's fond of saying, we've never had a case of fracking causing pollution. And I was on Ohio Public Radio debating Chris Tucker of Energy in Depth, and I brought up this issue because it just happened a couple weeks prior to that interview. And I said, here's an example your listeners should know about fracking causing contamination. This is fracked water coming back to the surface and polluting. And Mr. Tucker responds, well, Mr. Wilson's wrong. That wasn't a hydraulic fracking event. The hydraulic fracking trucks had left 2 hours earlier. This is just part of how the industry is splitting that phrase about fracking not causing contamination. For us citizens, we mean the whole drilling thing. Next slide. This is a well that had really gone bad near Clark, Wyoming. It was fracking for tight sands, and when they fractured, they lost all circulations. It's hard to see in the left-hand picture, but see the little bit of lighter gray and on the road in front of the big blue derrick? These are little geysers. There were several hundred of them. So much pressure came back up the casing that it blew the muds out and it came clear to the surface. Next slide. Now here is a Niobrara well that blew out also because of lack of blowout preventer on a second frac job. That's not a fire. That's just oil spreading across the prairie. And this is in Laramie County, about 90 miles north. So I want to talk about the Niobrara because that's really going to be the next big event here on the Front Range. So much gas has been drilled in Pennsylvania that the price of natural gas has actually gone down significantly. The price of natural gas used to be up at $11, $12 per MCF. It's dropped to $4.30 because so much supply close to the demand center in New York and Boston. So drilling for natural gas here will take on a little less anxiety, a little less slower pace here in Colorado. But not for drilling for oil. I mean, unlike natural gas, which isn't shipped out of the United States, oil is a world commodity, and it's high price. Its prices stay relatively high. So the industry is really interested in tying up as much land as it can, and it has, and as much water as it can, and it has, to get at this resource. We're now going to be seeing a huge industry come up from Cheyenne to New Mexico. There is no place that this formation is not present. Because remember, they're not going after those traps. They're going after the source rock. This is the source rock, the Niobrara. Next slide. It's a boom. What can I say? The first one well into this formation was in Weld County. It was done by EOG Resources, called the Jake 2 well. And it hit a gusher almost. almost. It hit 90,000 barrels per the first 50,000 barrels in the first 90 days. It's kept up a high rate, not that high, but high throughout, so that a single well might produce $5 or $10 million per year for these companies. So we've seen a rapid change in this industry of what they're doing. All these are deep into this formation, and they're all drilled with horizontal legs, long horizontal legs, at least a mile. We've had just 18 of these wells in 09, and then it jumped to 95. This year, it's already 147, 607 permits. And look at this next number. Now, I'm not trying to hype it, but this is the industry's own hype. And what they're saying is 10 to 20 million barrels of oil per section per square mile. That's $1 to $2 billion of potential income to these companies per 640 acres that they're tying up. And they've tied up hundreds of thousands of private acres along the Front Range for this purpose. The Niobrara, I wish I had a good geologic map, but it comes right up to Boulder. I'm not sure where the boundary is, but it's going to be somewhere in the Boulder city limits. Denver is clear inside, and all the cities in the Front Range, Longmont, Fort Collins, Broomfield, are going to have potentially this type of drilling. We're hearing a little bit of information about Denver leasing off DIA for this purpose. So far in Boulder County, there's only 2 permits for horizontal drilling. They were both issued this year. None have been spudded out. None have been drilled. We know we got an urgent need to improve. Look, we have thousands of wells that go bad. We have these toxic spills that occur. Let me give you one example of a toxic spill that occurred and what happens. Williams Production Company, 2007, is on the middle fork of Parachute Creek. They have a spill, they don't report it, of some kind of fluids at the well pad. A couple months later, one of the local ranchers is drinking out of the spring that comes right off of the terrace there, and it sends him to the hospital. His name is Ned Prather. Well, the company does get fined, about a $500,000 fine, but Ned Prather is now settled with Williams Company, and there's no cleanup of the groundwater. The settlement may have been fine for Mr. Prather, let's hope so, but it's a private contract between the two parties, and the state doesn't require cleanup. All the state does is fine the company for the spill. So industry's buying out these damaged homeowners if they can prove it. But they always require the homeowner to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So we, the public, know nothing about what was the cause of the accident, more importantly, how to prevent that kind of accident in the future. It's all literally hidden underground. And the other reason we know we got a problem, we have identical public risk being cited by citizens coming in from all over the country. I mean, from Texas to Garfield County to Pennsylvania to Wyoming, we're hearing people report they've got nerve pain, they've got bloody noses, they've got headaches, they've got severe problems from what may well be inhaling these hazardous pollutants coming off the frac jobs. But scientifically, we don't know that. Now, there's going to be a lot of reasons we may not be able to know that. We humans are the worst guinea pigs in the world. We have all this lifestyle, and we've lived this long. We're not really good lab people for scientists to work information out, especially when you're working with an ambient population. More importantly, though, we haven't done any study. The only study going on in Colorado, the one in Garfield County, was canceled in June, right before it was finished. And it was canceled by Garfield County commissioners, and along with it they fired their oil and gas liaison, a woman named Judy Jordan, who was doing an excellent, quite independent job of trying to keep that information going. That health impact statement being done by CU is now stopped. Next slide. Here's the analogy I use. You know, as many of us are passengers on public transport through the air. I mean, airplanes have really improved their safety record. And there's a big reason for that. We have a public, transparent process. When there's a plane crash, the NTSB shows up, takes charge. And you're going to find out within 2 or 3 months what happened. Was it the pilot? Was it poor maintenance? Was it the manufacturer? And regardless of how that comes out, the industry improves from that information and is ordered to improve. As a result, we have a really low risk of consequence from that type of transport. We always learn. Not so in the oil business. You know, we need something like that. We need an oil and gas national safety board that can come in after there's accidents, figure out what went wrong, help clean it up, and more importantly, figure out what steps are needed to prevent the future accidents. We learn nothing from our mistakes in this business. And like we talked about, if it's a public owner, if it's a private party that proves their tort claim, they get bought out and no information is shared with the public either. So here's some ways we can improve it. And this is my dreaming. You know, I would pass a National Oil and Gas Safety Board, and I would get the industry to work on a performance-based. I wouldn't have let a company drill in my county until they improved their first well was clean. Now, how are you going to do that? I mean, that's possible. We can get heavily monitored conditions on these companies, make them prove they're doing a clean job before they go on and do the next one. And we can remove these national criteria so we have somebody else on the playing field. You know, we're lacking adequate number of refs in the state, and we're lacking a number of levels of refereeing. We need the federal government to have some role in here so the states don't all let these companies work to their own bottom line. You know, we have 88 companies working in one county, and they're only regulated by some 37 people by the Oil and Gas Commission. So it's very easy for the industry to kind of isolate that state agency and not have any check from above or below. And these safer technologies can be required, like the green completions. Halliburton, once it was subpoenaed to give all its toxic information, said the next week, oh, by the way, we have non-toxic fracking fluids. Now, I don't know if they're using them or not, but their executives are drinking them at some of their big symposiums. But they're saying it's possible. Let's make it required. Okay? Now, you can lobby your officials at every level to make sure we have monitoring before the industry comes in. We shouldn't let them play this game. You don't know what was there before, so you can't prove you're contaminated now. Oh, that's just ridiculous. And it's pretty inexpensive to have domestic wells tested for this. And a bunch of us around the country are giving recommendations and ways to get it. But right now, you can't get a grant from EPA to test your baseline before it comes in. EPA will only give you money to test your well if it's been contaminated, but not before. And there's a point up here about pressuring your county. Where is Boulder County officials on this? Does anybody know in the audience whether Boulder County is considering its own rules? Well, I'm working with Gunnison County, La Plata County, Saguache County. All three of them have made efforts to tighten up the state's rules by having their own county rules. And it's quite controversial because the state threatens to sue the county based on the state having the sole right to regulate downhole. But it's clear from the case law that states don't have the power to regulate the movement of these toxic materials to the well or away, that they don't have the ability to stop the county from requiring monitoring wells, for instance. I'd like to see monitoring wells go in above, and that is upgrading and downgrading of each one of these pads so we can see if the companies are doing something wrong. Certainly the county can do conditions like that. And we're starting to see some citizens monitor at their own expense. You know, for years we've had it pretty easy that you can get grants and go out and monitor water conditions. If it's pretty easy, you can go out and take a glass vial, dip it into the stream at proper procedure and send it to the lab. You can do water sampling. But there hasn't been a lot of citizens doing air sampling. Well, that's changing because there's little gadgets becoming available to do it. There's a little $500 kind of a cigarettes package device that'll measure particulates, and I see some citizens using this. This is a little tool that came out of the space technology for clean rooms. You make sure that when you're manufacturing space instruments, you had no dust whatsoever in the room. So these little instruments are portable, and they give you a real-time reading just on particulates. And we're seeing a few citizens go out with these expensive cameras. You saw in the movie GASLAND what it looks like when the VOCs come off. You can put an infrared camera out there, a video camera, and see these. Otherwise, they're not visible. And the most clever one is a group out of Western Colorado Congress and its associates who are actually doing their own hazardous air pollutants. Now, this is they're trying to pick up where there's a bad odor, or where there's been a spill, there's been some peak event, and they go out with just a little canister and a little dust buster, the piece of remote vacuum equipment that they can make a vacuum inside of a can, and then when they open the valve, that air sample comes in, it goes to the lab, costs about $250 a sample. And it's really clever. Those citizens helped prove there was toxic hydrogen sulfide gas in Garfield County when the state of Colorado said it wasn't there. This just happened just in June. Next slide. Well, this is what I'm afraid that politicians want to do to the EPA and the rest that would regulate this industry. I mean, you see what's going on in one party's run for its nominee for president. My conclusion is, it's up to us citizens. We can't blame the oil industry too much. If you put an aggressive team out on the field and you have bad referees, you may see a bad game. We need better referees. We need citizens taking all kinds of actions. Either pursuing that total ban, the way Pittsburgh did, or pursuing better regulations the way Garfield County and Saguache County is doing. I thank you for your time and attention. We'll invite Phil up now, and we'll take questions after we're listening.
I speak from memory, so my remarks will be much shorter. Do any of you have any idea how much land has been leased, federal land has been leased to the oil and gas industry in the state? Take a guess.
10 acres.
Would you guess in the millions? What if I told you it was a land mass the size of New Jersey? Because that's what's happened. Well, we were having dinner, the federal government, in the person of the Bureau of Land Management, has leased almost 5 million acres of public land to the oil and gas industry. And much of it has been leased at a pittance of $250 an acre. So Wes was talking about a section, 640 acres, maybe generating $1 to $2 billion worth of revenue to the oil and gas industry, and we're leasing it out at $250. And then the royalty is 12.5%. That's a little complicated, but that's all we get. And remember, it belongs to us. The oil and the gas belongs to the people, as does the land. So keep that in mind when you talk to your representatives about, are we getting a square deal here? How much state land do you think has been leased while we were having dinner to the oil and gas industry? Something close to 700,000 acres. So combined, state and federal, we have a land mass about the size of Massachusetts, already leased to the oil and gas industry. Guess how many studies, economic, social, environmental, have been conducted on this massive transfer of ownership from the public to the oil and gas industry? How many? 0. This is unconscionable. How can this happen? We have laws that say significant federal actions require examination to protect the public, to give the public an opportunity to participate, and to comment on it. This has not been done. We have written the BLM, which is largely responsible for this activity, since even the Forest Service turns over the leasing to the BLM. And keep in mind that just a few years ago, the BLM was probably the sleepiest agency in the Department of Interior, and that's saying a lot. There are a lot of sleepy ones there. And they were basically responsible for leasing land to ranching interests. That's what they did. They did, and they were captives. I mean, they were probably more subject to regulatory capture than any other agency in Interior. And that's hard to that's hard to stomach too. But I worked there, I know. So this has all happened to us, and nothing has been done. It's the attitude of the BLM is, well, we're only permitting one well at a time. That's what's being permitted. That's the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission's attitude. Well, we're only permitting one well at a time. But that's tantamount to saying that, well, let's put 100,000 parking stalls up in the Rocky Mountain National Park, but we'll examine the impacts only as we build each stall. And we'll never look at the 100,000 stalls. We'll just look at each stall at a time. You never get to where you need to be. You never understand the consequences of your actions if you take that approach. And that's exactly the approach that's being advocated by the state of Colorado and the federal government. On top of that, we have this huge, massive amount of water that's going to be required to do this fracking. Wes talked about this, very generally. But for each well, each frac, the initial frac takes about 15 acre-feet of water. That's enough water for the annual water demand of 150 people. So each frac, guess how many wells they plan to drill in this state in the next 10 years? Guess.
100,000.
100,000 wells. 100,000 wells. And each initial frac is going to take at least 15 acre-feet. In Texas, they're saying up to 30 acre-feet. But anyway, it's a massive amount of water. And then on top of that, realize that each well is fracked 6 or 7 times. Now the water use goes down each time because some of that water, about 50% of it stays down. So incrementally it goes down. But you're still talking about millions of acre-feet of water. And Wes and I did kind of a back of an envelope look at this, just flatlining it and looking at, say, an 18-year time horizon. And we came out, almost 70,000 acre-feet a year. That's enough, that's enough water for the people of Denver. That's enough water for 700,000 people. Where are we going to get this water? Every river system in this state, with the exception of North Platte and the Colorado River, is over-appropriated. You and I are paying millions and millions of dollars for the Arkansas because we stole water from Kansas. On the Republican River, we stole water from Kansas. On the Platte River, we took water that were needed for endangered species. The Rio Grande, we built the Closed Basin Project because we stole water from New Mexico. Where is this water going to come from? How are we going to provide 70,000 acre-feet a year for the next 20 years to the oil and gas industry? Well, they're going to take it from existing users. And they're starting about this business right now. But keep in mind, the water belongs to us. It's black letter law. The rivers of this state belong to the public. They don't belong to the state. They don't belong to the oil and gas industry. They belong to us. And we have a right to object to the use of our resources in this manner without our consent and without our knowledge. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is that we need to organize ourselves, like Gandhi said, 1,000 gnats on the hide of an elephant, until they start paying attention. That this is not the way we want our state to look. They're continuing to lease. I mean, it's 5 million a day, but there are 24 million acres of federal land in this state, and a lot of it's, appropriate for oil and gas exploration. And on top of that, you've got all this private land, and nobody knows how much land that is being leased there, and how much water requirement is going to be. So, we just don't know, and nobody seems to care. We, at Be the Change, we have been to countless hearings before the BLM. Every time they have a hearing, we go there and say, look, you're not doing this right. You need to do something comprehensive about what this means to the people of this state and where these resources are going to come from. And indeed, we even have the resources to accomplish this. It seems to me that at some point, the principle of triage has to be employed here. Can we really do this? I mean, this is how absurd it is. In Park County, which happens to be the headwaters for Denver's water supply, that's where we get our water. And just because Boulder doesn't get, this is the great web of things. These things are all interconnected. You can't separate them. I keep telling these folks, it's the great web. The rivers run east and the rivers run west, but we have to see them as an integrated way. But what they've done in Park County is the BLM and the state of Colorado have leased 80,000 acres in our headwaters. And they continue to lease more. There's the potential up there of leasing perhaps 300,000. For the first stage of this, what they call a little area, the Bald Hill unit, which is 27,000 acres, El Paso Oil and Gas intends to put in 300 wells. Well, if you extrapolate to 80,000, that's about 1,000 wells. And that's only 80,000 out of 300,000 acres. Can we really sustain that? Is that really where we want the oil and gas industry in our headwaters? I mean, New York City said no. Syracuse said no. But the governor says, well, it's safe. How does he know? I mean, the evidence suggests that it isn't safe. But even beyond that, is that what we want? Is that really what we want our state to look like? Can you imagine coming over Kenosha Pass and you'll have this great big birthday cake or wedding cake down there, and all these gas and oil wells will be flaring and burning off methane? I mean, is that what we want our state to look like? But no, Erasmus said, "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." So did Tom Waits, and that's really what we have here: is that we have a blind government leading us God knows where, and we have to be the one-eyed man because apparently there's too much money involved here for them to say no. And it really is. I mean, I think that's really what's driving this whole thing. The state's broke, the feds are broke, the counties are broke, the cities are broke, and we get a pittance from this. The state gets something for its leases, about $2 up in Park County. That's what they're getting, $2 for a lease. It's good for 5 years. They have to pay a minimum $150 each year thereafter, and then they get 16.5% of the royalty. And then we get a severance tax of 4.5%. So basically, we who own this resource collectively get 20%, and the oil and gas industry get 80%. Now, if that seems like a good deal to you, the people in Norway don't think that's a very good deal. They get almost all of it. In the feds, it's even worse. In the feds, they lease an acre for $250, the same acre that's going to generate $1 billion. 640 of those acres, $1 billion and $2 billion, and we only get 12.5% in royalty. Yet you go to private landowners, and in Colorado, for instance, Wes and I have been down in Elbert County, most of those people are being offered 20%. I've talked to landsmen from Texas, where people really know what they're doing, and he tells me that down there, these people won't lease their land for less than 25%. So why are we getting so because the states are broke, and they see this as a revenue source. I mean, the State Land Board, this is where they get the money for the schools. You have to kind of sympathize with them, but it's destructive. I mean, in the long term, it's destructive. They're going to be here for 30 years maybe, and then what? We're still back to the problem I mean, how can anybody be damaged? If only 30% of it's in production, you got 70% of it that's not in production. That's plenty of area for these guys to fool around with and, drill wells. But no, they won't do that. I mean, they're desperate. And I think we should be desperate in our reaction to what they've done to us. Because they certainly, I don't think we just have to organize and, take on this juggernaut. Because I don't think you can stop it. But perhaps we can make it rational. And certainly there ought to be areas. And even Ken Salazar, who I hardly ever agree with, says that, there should be some places that are off limits. Well, there are no places in Colorado. If Denver's water supply isn't off limits, what the hell is off limits? I mean, I talked to people at the Forest Service, and I said, well, what about the Pawnee grasslands? Oh, they've leased that out to the oil and gas industry. How do you think the dicky birds are going to feel about that? Hey, did you know that? Has anybody ever talked about? You can't read this in the newspaper. It's not part of the daily dialogue. It should be, but it's not. This is simply an outrage. It simply is. And I don't know what you can do. I mean, this is a local control state. The municipalities have a lot of power. It's home rule. You've got 1041 powers under the state constitution, where you can protect your water supply. I think it's 1034, wildlife protection. But see, that's incremental. I think what we really need to do is force the government, the state government and the federal government, to be honest with us and say, look, we want to know the extent of this enterprise and what it's going to make this state look like And where are you going to find the water, and from whom? Obviously, it's going to come from the farming and ranching industry. But we know, Wes and I know for a fact, that these small towns up here, Longmont, these towns are selling water to the oil and gas industry. And in some cases, it's reported that they're doing it at a subsidized rate for less than their cost of production. I mean, these things are outrageous, to me anyway. I mean, in a democratic society, where we're supposed to have a say in what goes on. You know, I think that this citizenship Bill of Rights, the Community Bill of Rights, that like they did in Pittsburgh, I think people ought to start looking at that. Where, you know, they as a constitutional right, we have a right to clean air, water, and land, and you know, I think that holds some promise for us. But we've just got to stay at this as hard as we possibly can, or else we're going to find ourselves subservient to the oil and gas industry for a long, long time.